In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus did not discover a new world. He was following a map to a forgotten one. The document he clutched, shielded from the salt spray in an oilskin pouch, was not a hopeful guess or a sailor's fantasy. It was a fragment, a shard of impossible knowledge. History tells us of the Piri Reis map, an artifact of the early 16th century so baffling in its precision that it remains an enigma. But in our timeline, it was merely the last, faded copy to become public, the last echo of a secret that had set the world on fire a generation earlier. Because this map was not the work of a Turkish admiral, its source was far, far older, and it was not the only one. The race began in 1488, not with a royal decree, but with a storm, a tempest of biblical fury that drove a Portuguese caravel, under the command of Bartolomeu Dias, hundreds of miles off its course along the African coast. Lost and crippled, they found shelter in a strange, placid bay, protected by cliffs carved with geometric patterns that defied erosion. Here, seeking fresh water, his men stumbled upon it, not a cave, but an entrance, a doorway sealed in a material that was not quite stone, which crumbled to dust at their touch. They found no gold, no jewels. They found a library, a repository of charts, wound tight on spindles of a dark, weightless metal. When unfurled, the maps showed the world, not as it was, but as it had been. Coastlines were subtly different. Islands existed where there was now only open ocean. And across these impossible geographies were lines of energy, lee lines of power, all converging on specific points marked with symbols no human had ever conceived. When Dias returned to Lisbon, he brought back not just news of a Cape of Good Hope, but a secret that would poison the very heart of the Age of Discovery. King John II understood immediately. This was not a map for trade. This was a schematic for power. He classified the discovery under the penalty of death. Expeditions were secretly commissioned. Their new purpose was not to find a sea route to India, but to reach these coordinates, to find what lay at the terminus of the glowing lines. The Portuguese believed they were alone in this secret war. They were wrong. Across the Iberian Peninsula, in the royal court of Castile and Aragon, a similar secret was festering, a secret delivered not by a storm, but by a dying scholar during the final days of the Reconquista. A man who, in exchange for his life, offered Queen Isabella a single, priceless scroll salvaged from a library hidden beneath the Alhambra. It showed a different part of the globe, an ocean, far to the west, and in that ocean, a concentration of nexus points unrivaled anywhere else on the chart. This single decision had a terrifying, unforeseen consequence. The Age of Discovery was no longer about exploration. It became a frantic, undeclared arms race between two empires, both wielding a key without any understanding of the lock it was meant to turn. Columbus was chosen, a man of immense ambition and questionable geography, but he was devout and, most importantly, expendable. His public mission was to find a westward passage to the Indies. His true mission, known only to him and his queen, was to reach a location marked on the scholar's map as the font, the wellspring. When his lookout finally screamed, "Tierra! Tierra!" Quote, it was not just land they had found. They had arrived. As his men waded ashore, they were met with more than the indigenous Taino people. They were met with silence, a profound, unnatural quiet that emanated from the island's interior, a silence that hummed. Deep within the jungles of what would be called Hispaniola, they found it, a monolithic structure that rose above the canopy, its angles sharp, its surfaces unnervingly smooth despite millennia of neglect. It was not built of blocks. It seemed to have been cast in a single piece. No doors were visible, no windows, but as the Spaniards drew closer, their compasses began to spin violently. The air grew thick with static. Some men complained of hearing a low-frequency thrumming in their bones. This was no temple built by human hands. It was a component, a piece of a machine. But to understand how this led to a world on the brink of remaking itself, we must first travel thousands of miles south, to where a rival Portuguese fleet, under the command of a ruthless captain named Pereira, was following its own fragment of the atlas. Their map did not lead them to land, but to a specific, desolate coordinate in the South Atlantic, perilously close to the growing ice sheets of the south. Here, they found something else, a vast, submerged ring of metal that did not corrode, resting on the abyssal plain. Its surface was covered in the same alien script as their map. It was utterly dormant, yet the water around it was fractionally warmer than the surrounding sea, and strange, ghostly lights would sometimes dance between its towering pillars. They had found another node of the network, another piece of the antediluvian engine. For 5 years, this silent war raged across the globe. Small fleets, dispatched under false pretenses, hunted for these installations. The Spanish in the west, the Portuguese in the east. They found them half buried in the shifting sands of unnamed deserts, slumbering in the deepest trenches of the ocean, and encased in the ice of the far north. Each one was different, unique. Each one was inert, a sleeping giant. The race was no longer just to find them, it was to figure out how to wake them up. The breakthrough came in 1497. A Spanish expedition, having lost half its men to disease and the jungle's horrors, found a way inside one of the land-based structures in the Yucatan. Following a barely audible resonance, they discovered a central chamber. It was a control room. The air was cool, sterile, and smelled of ozone. Crystalline panels covered the walls, and in the center of the room, a pillar of light projected a three-dimensional map of the planet. Not a map of land and water, but of energy flows and nodal points. It was the master schematic, the user manual. A young captain, driven by greed and the promise of glory from his patrons, ordered his most trusted lieutenant to activate it. He pointed to a single, large glyph on a gleaming console, a glyph that pulsed with a faint, inviting rhythm. The man reached out. His finger, trembling, made contact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, 6,000 miles away, the South Atlantic installation erupted. The submerged ring, dormant for 10,000 years, blazed with the light of a captive star. The water around Pereira's ships flash-boiled into steam. A pillar of pure, white-blue energy, a mile wide, shot from the depths of the ocean, punching through the waves and soaring into the upper atmosphere. The sky itself seemed to tear open. He hadn't just switched on a light. He had thrown the master breaker on a machine that spanned the globe, a machine with a purpose they could not possibly comprehend. And it was now powering on, piece by terrifying piece. The catastrophic feedback loop lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. When the blinding light subsided, the lieutenant was dead, but not in any way they understood. His body was slumped over the console, his hand still resting on the glyph, but the flesh of his fingers had become translucent, crystalline, as if the energy hadn't just killed him, but had begun to rewrite his very matter. The true horror, however, was playing out on the holographic globe. The single point of light in the South Atlantic was no longer just a point. It was spreading. For Captain Pereira and the Portuguese fleet, there was no sound, no explosion in the traditional sense. There was only light and dissolution. The energy pillar did not behave like anything in God's creation. It did not dissipate. It stabilized. A shimmering, impossible cylinder of light connecting the ocean floor to the heavens. Inside this column, the sea, the air, even the light itself behaved differently. The water did not boil. It simply ceased to be water, becoming a swirling vortex of geometric patterns. The sky, visible through its translucent walls, was not their sky. It was a starscape of chilling, alien beauty. What had the Spanish done? This wasn't a weapon. A weapon destroys. This, remade. The captain, his mind reeling, looked back at the globe. The lines on the map weren't just energy conduits. He was a navigator, a cartographer at heart. He understood maps, and he suddenly realized, with a soul-crushing certainty, what he was truly looking at. It was a map of physics, of reality itself. Each node wasn't a power station. It was an anchor, a pin holding the fabric of their existence in place, and they had just pulled one of the pins. Across the globe, the other installations responded, not with violent eruptions, but with insidious subtlety. In the heart of the Sahara, a buried node hummed to life, and for 100 miles in every direction, the sand began to vibrate, aligning itself into vast, complex fractal patterns visible only from orbit. Deep beneath the Tibetan plateau, another component began to resonate, not with energy, but with sound. A single, impossibly low frequency that geologists thousands of years in the future would struggle to explain. A hum that seemed to subtly alter the resonant frequency of stone itself. The engine was not just waking up, it was tuning itself. But tuning for what? To play what symphony? The news, when it trickled back to Europe via terrified, half-mad survivors, was incomprehensible. It spoke of pillars of impossible light and ships that dissolved into nothing. The Portuguese blamed the Spanish for unleashing some unholy power. The Spanish, possessing the control room, accused the Portuguese of sabotage. But in the highest courts of Lisbon and Castile, a colder, more terrifying reality began to sink in. The maps they had so coveted, the keys to this immense power, were changing. The information was updating in real time. The lines of energy were rerouting, bypassing the damaged South Atlantic node. The machine was healing itself. It was adapting. This was not some ancient relic they could control. It was a living system, and they were fleas crawling on its skin. The captain in the Yucatan felt a profound shift, not in the room, but in himself. The air felt different. The faint hum of the installation had changed its pitch, becoming more biological. It was the sound of a heartbeat. He looked at the holographic globe, at the spreading web of light, and understood the fatal flaw in their ambition. They had sought to control the world. But what if this machine was never meant to control the world? What if it was designed to control what it means to be in the world? They hadn't just turned on a power source. They had initiated a protocol, a change order for reality itself. And the world they knew, the very ground beneath their feet, was now scheduled for deletion. The captain took a stumbling step back from the holographic globe. The change protocol was not just redrawing the map. It was overwriting the territory. He looked at his own hand, no longer trembling. It was fading, less a physical object and more a suggestion. A memory of flesh and bone held together by a fading belief. He could see the humming light of the console straight through his palm. The symphony reached its first crescendo. It was not a sound one heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the soul, a fundamental retuning of what was possible. In Rome, the marble saints in St. Peter's Basilica wept tears of liquid mercury, their stone faces twisting not in anguish, but in the ecstasy of new creation. The Colosseum's ancient stones reassembled themselves, not into the arena it once was, but into a perfect, seamless ring that levitated silently above the ground. The captain felt no pain, only a profound, chilling sense of dislocation, as if he was a word in a sentence that was being erased and rewritten. He turned his gaze from the globe to the crystallized form of his lieutenant, the first man to be touched by the change. He was not a corpse, he was an artifact, a fossil from a forgotten reality. Soon, they all would be. The monarchs in their distant courts were the last to understand, and they understood the least. They were kings and queens of a memory, their power, their treaties, their wars, all footnotes in a history book that had just been set ablaze. The maps they held were no longer guides to the future, but tombstones for the past. They were staring at the birth certificate of their replacement. He was untethered from everything he had ever known. Gravity was a memory. The air in his lungs was a final, fading courtesy. Below him, he saw the world he knew. The world of water, of soil, of men, being unwritten. Oceans drained away into shimmering geometric voids. Continents cracked and reformed like clay in a god's hands. He saw the engine, not as a network of nodes, but as the loom upon which the tapestry of existence was woven, and the weavers had decided to create a new design. The old world did not end in fire or flood. It ended in a quiet, perfect, and utterly indifferent revision. A new Earth settled into its new orbit, under a new sky. The symphony was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Some histories are forgotten, others are erased. To discover what other truths have been rewritten, and to question the very fabric of the past, subscribe to ChronoShift, because the history you know is only one version of the